Today I will be going through an example of comparative advantage. In our example, there are two producers and two goods. Sally can make 5 hats or 10 belts. Jim can make 3 hats or 18 belts. Who has the absolute advantage for each of these goods? Who has the comparative advantage for each of these goods? Will they trade at a price of 3 hats for 15 belts? First, take a moment to think about how comparative advantage is different from absolute advantage. So absolute advantage is just who can produce more of a certain good, whereas comparative advantage is whoever can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. Take a moment to think about the definition of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is whatever you're giving up in the problem. It's usually defined as the next best option. So today I'm going to show you how I usually solve this problem. I begin by organizing the information. Organizing the information really helps to keep from getting things confused. If you're a visual learner, then you might absorb the information better this way. But even if you're not, it will still help you to avoid making mistakes. We know that our two goods are hats and belts, and our two producers are Sally and Jim. And we know that Sally can make 5 hats or 10 belts, and Jim can make 3 hats or 18 belts. Now we're going to simplify these ratios in order to get 1 hat and then eventually 1 belt so that we can better see the comparison. 5 over 10 simplifies to 1/2, and 3 over 18 simplifies to 1/6. Now we're going to divide 2 by itself in order to make it 1 belt, and then that leaves us with 1/2 of a hat. And then we're going to divide 6 belts by 6 in order to get 1 belt, and then that'll give us 1/6 of a hat. Now I'm going to write this out so that it's easier to understand conceptually. For those of you who don't love math, this might help you. In Sally's production, for every 1 hat she produces, she gives up producing 2 belts, and for every 1 belt she produces, she gives up producing 1/2 of a hat. In Jim's production, for every 1 hat produced, he gives up 6 belts, and for every 1 belt produced, he gives up the production of 1/6 of a hat. So now we've finished setting up the beginning of the problem, and we're going to start answering the questions. Now looking at our chart, who has the absolute advantage in hats? Sally does, because she produces 5 hats while Jim can only produce 3. Who has the absolute advantage in belts? Jim does, because Jim can produce 18 while Sally can only produce 10. Going back to our definitions, in order to determine the comparative advantage, we need to look at our opportunity costs. Who do you think has the comparative advantage in hats? Sally, because for every hat that Sally makes, she gives up only 2 belts, while for every hat that Jim makes, he gives up 6 belts. Now, who do you think has the comparative advantage in belts? It's Jim, because for every 1 belt that Jim makes, he gives up producing 1/6 of a hat, whereas Sally gives up 1/2 of a hat to produce a belt. In other words, Sally has the lower opportunity cost of producing hats, whereas Jim has the lower opportunity cost of producing belts. Now we know that the price they're given is 3 hats for 15 belts. Now we're going to do the same thing as before and simplify until we get the opportunity cost of 1 hat and 1 belt. So in order to produce 1 hat, you would be giving up 5 belts. Some people might be able to do this in their head, but I strongly suggest just writing it all out. That way you don't get confused, especially if you're someone who doesn't love math. So in other words, to produce 1 belt, you would be giving up 1/5 of a hat. Once again, I'm going to write all of this out in words so that we understand what the ratios mean. So since Sally has the comparative advantage in hats and Jim has the comparative advantage in belts, we know that Sally is going to produce hats and Jim is going to produce belts. So do you think that Sally and Jim will trade at this price of 3 hats for 15 belts? They will, because for every 1 hat that Sally produces, she will get 5 belts, which is more than the 2 belts that she could have produced on her own. And for every 1 belt that Jim produces, he will get 1/5 of a hat, which is more than the 1/6 of a hat he could have produced on his own. And in terms of opportunity cost, both Sally and Jim are getting more than they're giving up.